So moving on to the notes right here, completing the square is what we were just doing on the previous part of these notes, where you take half of b and square it, okay? So let me show you how we're going to apply that on a quadratic equation like this one. Now, I haven't even described the steps. I'm actually going to show you how to solve it, explain the steps, and then we'll talk about the steps. So the first thing to do is to make space for your new perfect c value, okay? So I'm going to rewrite this thing, x squared plus 4x. I'm going to put a blank spot equals 10, and I'm also going to put a blank spot over here on this side. Now, why do I want to put a blank spot on both sides? That way it'll remind me that whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other, okay? Because it's an equation. So once again, what would be beautiful to have right here so I could actually have a perfect square quadratic trinomial? What number would be awesome to have right here? 4. Now, how did we get that? Remember, you take the b value, you divide it by 2, and then you square it. So if I say 4 divided by 2, that's 2, and then 2 squared, that takes me back to 4. Okay? So I'm really adding a 4 right here, that perfect c value of 4. Now remember, this is an equation, and whatever you do to one side of an equation, you have to do to the other side of the equation in order to maintain the balance. Because right now you added 4, that means that this side is heavier than this side. So you also need to add 4 on this blank spot over here. Does that make sense? Okay, so from the notes above, we found out we became really good at finding the c value. How do you do that? You divide b by 2 and then square it. That's what we did. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. Add it to both sides. And now we're going to be able to write it as what times what will give us the c value that combined to give us the b value? 2, right? Now, the whole purpose is to be able to write it as a binomial squared, okay? And let me tell you this. Let me write it first. X plus 2 squared equals what? What do we have on this side over here? 14. So by us doing this, now we'll be able to apply a square root on both sides. So I will have x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 14. Whenever you apply a square root, you have to put a plus minus in front of your answer. Now, yeah, some of us are freaking out. Oh, the square root of 14, what do I do? If it were the square root of 25, I would actually write a 5. If it were the square root of 36, I would write a 6. If it were the square root of 20, I would even be able to break that down to 4 times 5 and simplify it. But 14, you can't break it down, so you're just going to leave it like that. Does that make sense? Okay. So all I need to do is subtract 2 on both sides. So my final answer will be x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 14. And that's it. Yes?
Now, what if you do the square root of a 2 and 2 square root of 7?
Let me pause this. So you actually saw me solve this quadratic equation using the completing the square method, even though I have not explained the actual steps. The steps are on the top right part of this page. So step 1, it says make sure the a value is 1. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to make sure that the a value is 1. If I go back down to here, is this a value 1 right here?
Yes.
Yes, it is. What if I would have had a 2 right here? What would I have to do? I'd have to get rid of the 2 by dividing everything by 2. Does that make sense? If I had a 2 right here, I'd have to divide by 2, divide by 2, divide by 2, and I'd have a new equation with the a value of 1. Are you guys with me? Okay, so you need the a value to be 1, but we already knew that this a value was 1 because it didn't have that 2 on the front. Okay, so let's go back up to here. Step 1 says you need the a value to be 1, and also make sure that there's space for your new C value. So you're actually going to physically leave a blank spot for your new perfect C value that we're going to add on. And remember, what is the C value? It's simply going to be B divided by 2 squared. That's where we get the perfect C value. Okay? And, of course, you're going to add it to both sides of the equation. You guys don't have to really worry about what it says right here in parentheses. Just remember this. Add it to both sides of the equation. I kind of crossed it out. I'm sorry. Add it to both sides of the equation in order to maintain the balance. And then it says factor to get a perfect square equation, which will be a binomial squared equaling a number. Now this plus or minus right here, it's not really the plus. I actually messed up right there. This is either going to be either positive or negative, not both plus or minus. Okay? That was my bad right there. The plus or minus, it should either be a plus or a minus. In other words, you will have x plus 3 if it's 6 over 2, or x minus 7 if it's 14 over 2, right? But not plus or minus. It's either plus or minus. Just keep that in mind. That was a typo on my part. I apologize. So the goal is to be able to write it as a binomial squared. Here's a binomial squared equals a number. Now, why do we want a binomial squared? That way we could square root the left side, square root the right side, and it'll get rid of the square. Okay? And that's what step 4 is, solving by square rooting both sides and simplifying if necessary. So let's take a look at this guy right here. And what is step 1 above? You guys could read it. What does it say?
Make sure the A value is 1.
That's right. Is A value 1?
Yes.
All right, cool. What else does it say on step 1?
Make sure there's space for the new C value.
Okay, so what I want to do is make space. So this is my old C value. I want to make space for my new C value. How am I going to do it? I want to subtract 86. Some math teachers don't like moving it over to the other side. Some math teachers actually just take the 86 and make some space right between it. I like to move it to the other side. It's up to you. So I'm going to have x squared minus 18x, and then blank spot equals negative 86. And you know what? I'm also going to put a blank spot on this side to help me remember that what I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So we are really good at finding that C value. How do we do that? You take half of B and square it. So what is half of B?
81.
Yeah, half of B squared is 81. So half of negative 18 is negative 9, and then negative 9 squared is positive 81. So I want to put a plus 81. That's my perfect C value. And plus 81. That's my perfect C value. I did it to both sides to maintain the balance. Okay, now check this out. The whole purpose of getting this perfect C value is to be able to write it as a binomial times a binomial, but ultimately to write it as a binomial squared. And I might as well teach you right now that you could actually skip this step right here and just jump to your binomial squared. The binomial squared part will always be, well, we're talking about x's, right? We have x's, so that's an x. And the number that's going to be right here will always be half of b. This number right here will always be half of b. Let me repeat that. This number right here is always going to be half of what you see here. What's half of this?
9.
So that's going to be a negative 9 right in there. Now, if you don't like doing that shortcut, go ahead and actually work it out. Put an x here, x there, and go ahead and think, what times what is 81? That if I add together is negative 18. Oh, that's going to be a negative 9 and a negative 9. And then you say, oh, I have the same x minus 9 here and x minus 9 there. I could write it as a x minus 9 squared. But you see all that time that I took to think that through to get to my binomial squared? Once you get your perfect C value and you add it to both sides, you could just jump to your binomial squared and write down your x and write down half of b, and you'll have your perfect binomial squared. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can take the long route if you want. On the right side, what am I going to have? Negative 5. Okay, so now I want to solve this thing. What am I going to do? Square root the left, square root the right. Let me move this up a little. So I will have x minus 9 equals, don't forget the plus or minus, And the square root of -5, you can't really simplify that, but the negative could actually come out, it's supposed to come out as an I square root of 5. So my final step will be to add 9 and add 9. So my answer will be x equals 9 plus or minus I square root of 5. And that is my solution. Now, I know that that looks ugly, but it actually ends up being an easier math problem because you don't have to, there's nothing to simplify right here. There's nothing that you're going to be adding or subtracting. You don't have to actually work out your two answers. You just write it like that. Cool? Let's try this next one. So, step 1, what do I need to do? Divide everything by 2 because my a value is not 1. So let me put a divided by 2 there, divided by 2 there, divided by 2 there. We will have k squared plus 8k. And you know what? We also want space for our new c value. So I might as well just leave a blank spot for my new perfect c value, the equal sign. And then over here on the right I have a -6. And I might as well put the blank spot over there so I could remember what I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. So how am I going to find this perfect c value right here? How am I going to find this perfect c value? Half of b and then square it. So what is half of 8 and then square it? So I really have plus 16 right here. And of course, this equation is no longer balanced if you add 16 over here. You also need to add 16 over here. Okay, so now I have a perfect square quadratic trinomial, and the whole purpose of getting this perfect c value is to be able to factor it to a binomial times a binomial, but I'm going to skip that step. I'm going to jump to the binomial squared part. It's really easy to do. You're dealing with k's instead of x's, and what number belongs right here with the k? A positive 4, because this is a positive 8. So I'm going to have a positive 4. It's simply half of b. Okay? Now, what if, just for fun, what if this would have been, instead of a plus 8, what if it would have been a minus 12? What would be right here? Minus 6. If this would have been a plus 20, what would be right here? Plus 10. If this would be a minus 2, what would be right here? Minus 1. Right? It's always going to be half of b. The number inside with your variable, when you have parentheses squared, the number inside with your variable will always be half of b. Okay? So on the right side, we have -6 plus 16. That's going to be 10. And now let's apply a square root here, square root there. You'll have k plus 4 equals what? Plus or minus, you have to remember the plus or minus 10. And for my final step, I need to subtract 4 here, subtract 4 over here. So my answer will be k equals -4 plus or minus square root of 10. Now, if your square root of 10 could be simplified, you should simplify it. But 10 is not a perfect square. You can't even rewrite it with multiplication to get a perfect square. So that's about all you could do. That's your answer. Now, if that would have been the square root of 20, you could break it down to 4 times 5 and then split the root and simplify the square root of 20. But 10, you can only break it down to 2 times 5, and neither of those are perfect square numbers. So that's as far as you could go. 32. Actually, we are out of time on this video. I'll do a video 3.